All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm glad we're all here on Zoom because it is darn cold outside. Welcome to the League of Women Voters, Leavenworth County monthly meeting. We're excited about our topic today, which is media coverage in Kansas. Our president, Leaque, hi Lisa, has lost her voice, so you're stuck with me on the introduction. Little admin first. As Sherry said, this session is being recorded, just so you know. Everyone should be muted, and please stay muted so that sound for everyone is good. Our format today is question and answer, so please put your questions in the chat, and Sherry Grogan will read the questions as they come up and as time permits, combining some of them so we can hopefully get to everybody's questions. As I said, our topic is media in Kansas, and we are privileged to have with us today as our guests Mr. Sherman Smith, editor-in-chief, and Mr. Tim Carpenter, senior reporter for the Kansas Reflector. I won't go into all their accolades. They asked me not to, but I am passing them the mic, and so they can talk and introduce themselves and talk about the Kansas Reflector. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having us. She said, I'm Sherman Smith. I'm the editor-in-chief of Kansas Reflector.
And I'm Tim Carpenter, a reporter.
I'm very thankful to have these opportunities. The League of Women Voters chapters and Women for Kansas chapters, especially around the state, have been very welcoming in giving us these opportunities, hosting forums like this virtually and in person. I'm a lifelong Kansan. I went straight from Emporia State University to work at the Topeka Capital Journal for 16 years. So I spent my whole professional life in journalism. Had this opportunity about 3 years ago now, in 2020, 3.5 years ago, to launch Kansas Reflector as a nonprofit covering state government and politics in Kansas. And we're an affiliate of States Newsroom, which is based out of North Carolina. They're working to set up affiliates like this all over the country to put bodies back into state houses where the ranks of reporters have been depleted over the years. This is all about a public service mission of trying to inform people and keep them engaged in what's going on in the states. So I launched with Tim, who I'd worked with at the Capital Journal, and a couple of others who have now gone on to other things at KCUR. I work with, I think, one of the best staffs anybody could hope for in journalism. I have a junior reporter in Rachel Mipro, who's over with us at the State House every day. She came up from Louisiana. We have Allison Kite, who's a reporter we share with our Missouri affiliate, based out of Kansas City. She's doing a big project right now on water. She covers the environment primarily for us. And we also have Clay Wirestone, who I think is maybe our most popular staff member because of the opinions that he writes. And he really curates the daily column that we offer for our readers. So we have one column every day, one opinion column that is, and then anywhere from 1 to 7 or 8 news stories. And right now, at this time of year, of course, we are primarily focused on the legislative session. I'll let Tim talk about our approach there.
And just real quickly about myself, I grew up on a farm in Missouri. I have an ag degree from Kansas State. Somehow stumbled into the journalism program over there. I was about ready to fail out of the university, I think, and learned that journalism was fun, fascinating. You go ask people in power intriguing questions and learn a lot of new things that are going on out there. So I worked at Union Press International, a wire service, when I got out of college. Then 15 years or so at the Lawrence Journal World, about 15 more years at the Topeka Capital Journal. The majority of that working in the State House and covering the day-to-day coverage of legislature, and then this Kansas Reflector. So I think if I did the math right, this is my 20th legislative session that I've covered day to day. So our focus right now at the Reflector is the Kansas legislature and the session that just started a week or so ago. And typically right now it's very snoozy, and the legislators spend all their time going eating free meals and drinking people's booze. But they got out of the gate early on a tax bill. So we've covered that this past week. The Kansas House and Senate passed a comprehensive tax bill that the governor is most assuredly going to veto. So that's kind of setting the foundation of tax policy and where they're going to go this year. and the debate and the fight. And so, but there's many other issues out there that we can talk about. We've covered it all. So, I look forward to your guys' questions.
Yeah, we don't want to spend a lot of time giving intros about ourselves, so we want to open it up, starting now for any questions that people have. If you want to start typing those in, if nobody asks questions, we'll start calling on you. And we see there's one already that asks who our Missouri affiliate is. That's the Missouri Independent. The editor there, my counterpart, is Jason Hancock, who is a longtime Kansas City Star political reporter and editor. We're up to, I lose the exact count, of about 40 affiliates across the country now. And the idea is that by the time of the November election, we'll have either an affiliate in every state or a partner that already exists, that we don't want to, create a new affiliate and compete with an existing nonprofit that's already doing this. So content sharing agreements with everybody that we don't have an affiliate
So
in their state.
each of these affiliates he's talking about, it would be, the Nebraska would have a state house bureau like we created here that covers politics, elections, state government, and we defined our coverage area very broadly. So anything you can connect to government, we'll parachute into local communities and do local government political stories. But we also try to keep tabs on the people in Congress as well. Somebody to keep an eyeball on those guys. So we define it very broadly, and so there's these bureaus around the country, and they keep adding them over time and filling in the U.S. Mainland map. Everybody's really interested in when our parent nonprofit, States Newsroom, creates the bureau in Hawaii. So of course I would be appointed to go work in Hawaii all the time. Is what
Yeah.
I'm thinking.
He didn't sign up for the Alaska gig. Yeah. Linda has another question here. How do all of the affiliates get funded? The bulk of our funding comes from States Newsroom. They're doing the fundraising for us on a kind of big picture national scale for people who support this. But we also do local fundraising drives. There's a section of our website where people can make a donation to us. Occasionally, we'll send out an email asking for donations. And so, States Newsroom, I feel like they give us enough money to exist. And then the money that we raise locally really helps with the operations, allows us to send reporters around the state to, cover things like the water project that I mentioned that Allison's working on, or to go down to Marion when there was the raid over the summer. It means we have cameras and the software and hardware that allows us to produce a podcast every week, that kind of stuff. States Newsroom, if you go to their website, there's a section where they list everybody who has donated. I think that it's 1,000 or more is the cutoff now. It's a very long list. I don't know who any of these people are. They don't really mean anything to me. And nobody tells us what we should be covering or how to cover it.
Yeah, there's probably some very well-heeled donors on that list, but the list would also include people like my wife,
Hmm.
who donated some money, and so we get checks for $10, and sometimes a lot more from people that are just really interested in state house and government reporting. Because, as we all know, the newspapers that I work for and others around the country have just been gutted. I think when I started the Topeka Capital Journal in '04, there might have been 40 something people in the newsroom. Now there's maybe 5. So this is what's happened, and the diminishment and about the number of reporters in the State House has been tremendous. So when I first started wandering around the Capitol building 25 years ago plus, the Kansas City Star would send 5 people, and then the Wichita Eagle was there, and they shared an office, and they could have as many people as they wanted there. Now they have one reporter who used to be one of our Capitol Journal interns representing the Wichita Eagle and the Kansas City Star. One person, when in you go into the distant past, and there would certainly been more than a half a dozen. So we're trying to help fill that void.
Go quickly through a couple of these questions that somebody asked if all the reporters get paid. Uh, they do. Tim wouldn't be here if I wasn't paying him. We offer competitive salaries. We also pay the health insurance premiums for our employees and have other generous benefits. And we really value employees' time and work here. We pay our freelancers as well, and it's one of the sticking points we have sometimes with some college programs is they want students to come do an internship for class credit, and I insist on actually paying people for their work. And I think it's important that we instill that in journalism students because newspapers and others in our profession have taken advantage of people for a long time. There's a question about whether if the governor vetoes the flat tax, is it still going to pass? They need 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the House to override a veto. When they passed it this week, they did not have those numbers. There were some people who were absent. They could always make some deals with people who were a no and get them to a yes. So nothing's ever certain until it happens. But at the moment, it's a long
Yeah,
shot.
so the House and Senate Republican leadership pushed through this tax package, but uh, a few days before this got rolling, the governor had a news conference with her own tax agenda. And at that news conference, she had two Republican senators and one independent senator at the news conference, Republicans endorsing the Democratic governor's tax plan. And that was significant because without those, they're all three conservatives that were there, pretty conservative people. Without those three on the Republican side on a veto override, it's unlikely they can get the 27 out of 40 votes they need to override the governor and get to that 2/3. I think they can get the 2/3 in the House, but not in the Senate. So that's the logjam for the Republican leadership is the governor's got three senators on her side to coalesce with the Democrats on to defeat that veto override.
It's a
We have a
question
question
of
about how do you gather the information that's reported about local school board meetings?
Well, we have covered some local school board issues, but we don't really cover at that micro level like that. There might be an issue that we might go to a school district in the middle of Kansas and write about a particular issue about banning books or something like that. But we don't personally cover the 275 plus public school districts in Kansas. It's just impossible staffing wise. And that really should be the responsibility of the local newspapers.
when we've parachuted into local issues like this, it's because it's an issue that has like a broader statewide implication. I think Rachel did a story about how there was a particular influence in driving far-right candidates into school board races in a number of communities across the state. And so she wrote about that. Occasionally when we go in, it's because there isn't a local newspaper or news source that's covering an issue, and it's something that really deserves attention. But for the most part, we just have to focus on statewide issues.
What are the effects of 24/7 news reporting?
Well, there was a time when I worked at a newspaper where my computer was at work, and if when I turned it off and went home, they might be able to call my landline phone and track me down. But the advent of cell phones and the advent of laptops and the introduction of hotspots and requires to the benefit of readers, but to the detriment of my personal life, the opportunity to shut that door. So, if the governor in the middle of the night decided to ride a motorcycle down the Topeka Boulevard and act crazy in the middle of the night, I probably would have to cover that. Whereas in the old days, I'd be minding my own business and we'll deal with it tomorrow. So it made everything much more immediate. And you just have to learn if you want to do this thing, you got to drop what you're doing sometimes and turn to a news story.
I would say it's been that way for a while now. Like I became the online editor at the Capital Journal in 2011, and we were already transitioning to a digital first publication where we were going to get these stories out in the middle of the night whenever news happened anyway. Um, but then it felt like we were being dragged down by having to stop periodically and figure out what we were going to do for print tomorrow. And I think one of the advantages we have now is, we don't have to worry about what's going to be the banner headline and the centerpiece, and somebody's got to go write something because we have this section front on, 5A where we have to have a local photo, and we don't have to worry about all of that anymore. We're putting out news throughout the day, and then our newsletter is just a reflection of what happened in the last 24 hours.
Sherman forgot to mention that our website, this is important because, I remember before my dad passed away, his subscriptions for a year to the Kansas City Star was $1,000. Keep in mind, there is no paywall on the Kansas Reflector website. There's no ads that any journalistic entity or in the world, can reprint our content for free, with attribution. So if you go around Kansas, you'll go to Arc City and Manhattan, whatever, you'll see that local newspapers are publishing our copy in their newspapers because they have staffing issues and they can put, and maybe they don't want to subscribe to the Associated Press version of state coverage, political coverage, and they can take ours for free. It's good for the budget.
We've had conversations with editors at some of these papers on like election night to say, if they have a print deadline where they have to send their pages out by 9 p.m., I've got to get a story to them by 8:30, and we don't know who's won the race yet, but I'll make sure that we have something available on our website in time for them to grab it and send it to print.
We have one more question here. It's about similar to what we've been talking about. What are the unique challenges of an online newspaper versus a printed paper in most people's experience?
Yeah, I think it's really about how you plan out stories and when you're going to publish things is just a little bit different. Um, the news gathering is very similar, as we said, to what we had at the Capitol Journal, but we're thinking now about how we maximize or how we get our best stories in front of the audience when we know we have the most people on our website. And so we have a new offering in the newsletter every morning, which is the opinion column, and then we try to get a fresh news story out at 8 or 9 a.m. And those sort of things are part of the calculation of when we're going to post something. If it's 5 o'clock at night and we've got another story, we might say, well, people generally are not reading stuff at 6:30 in the evening, so why don't we hold this until sometime tomorrow when we might get in front of more people.
The other thing about the Kansas Reflector is that 3 years ago, thereabouts, we were a new thing. I mean,
Yeah.
people, and then COVID was going on, and we wanted to do exactly what we're doing today, talking to people out there in Kansas about news. And we wanted to go out and go to Hayes and go to Dodge City and tell them about this new thing we had, but we couldn't travel anywhere. And so it was an impediment to getting the word out that there's this thing called the Kansas Reflector, and you can get your state house political news there. And so it's just an evolutionary process where people learn that this is a resource available to them. You could, when I worked at the Topeka Capital Journal, people would know, like, oh, they might have a story in the Topeka Capital Journal, and you could have an online subscription to that. And so people knew, even sources like organizations putting out news releases would send it to the Topeka Capital Journal, and somehow it'd get to the right person. We had to orient people to include us in those news releases, the Kansas Reflector, this thing they had never heard of before. So it's sort of a process of evolution and growth. And I think more and more and more people, when the Senate president complains about our coverage, like, you didn't like a story or something, then you're getting some traction in the state house. So, and we've had our stories quoted by all Republicans, Democrats, legislators in the Capitol building. They'll start waving around a printed out copy of one of our stories. So we know we're getting people's attention, and that's good.
Is the lack of reporters due to funding, actual number of reporters, technology that has cut costs, and decreased ability to report? What's the reason for the lack of reporters?
Yeah, I think, I don't really see a viable long-term business model for newspapers. And it doesn't matter if it's owned by a corporation or an individual, a family, whatever the model is. In every community across Kansas, the newspaper staff now is much smaller than it was 50 years ago or 20 years ago, even. And I think that it's because there's not that same revenue stream the newspapers have always had.
Yeah, so because the national advertising that used to be in all your newspapers got pulled back and put online, and then you have a change in the readership out there. Elderly people like my dad, he was never going to go online and read a paper, but he wanted to hold it in his hands. And so those people that are like that are older, and there's a younger generation like our kids that are about 30 years old they'll read stuff online on their phone, uh, but otherwise aren't going to subscribe to a paper. So there's just a total change in the culture of who's reading it, and that loss of national revenue in newspapers and the loss of local advertising revenue has just crippled newspapers. And also a bunch of newspapers have been bought up by venture capitalists who just want to suck the resources out of it, and they don't really care too much about what happens after that. And it's a huge crisis in a lot of communities in terms of the status of local coverage of local school boards, city council, county commission, and what about the high school, high school sports. And so I bleed for this problem. But this, like Sherman said, the solution is, I don't know. There's going to be more as time goes on, more newspapers are going to close.
What are the struggles with ad hoc but not professionally trained reporters? Meaning nearly any person with a smartphone can now be a member of the press.
Yeah, it's hard to come up with like a definition for what is a journalist versus what is not. I do think that technology makes it easier for anybody to get information out, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, whatever we want to call an individual who's doing that. I think about the teenage girl who stood there with her phone as George Floyd was being murdered by a police officer, with police yelling at her to stop, and she continued to film this. That is the only reason we know that police lied about what happened, and that this was actually a murder. And she was given a special commendation by the Pulitzer Committee that year.
There's a lot of bogus information that floats around, and people put out content that may sound authoritative, but is really not grounded in fact. And so as I've gone through my journalism life, spent a lot more time doing fact checking of what other people say. And so you just gotta, as a reporter, I'm standing there talking to the governor, or I'm talking to the chief of the Kansas Supreme Court, and you try to go to the proper sources and just not rely on the guy down the street who heard something at the restaurant, who heard it from somebody else that something is going on. So you got to watch your sources. I think generally the idea of opening up the media market and the information exchange has all been a good thing. As people exchange ideas, but I get some very serious heartburn about some of the baloney and the BS that's put online about what's going on. And I just don't understand sometimes the motivation of people who obviously put false information out there. I don't know why they're doing it. To win an election, I guess, is that the price? Is that what you're willing to do just to win an election? You know, I need
Okay.
glasses to read the questions. Are there more questions?
Yeah, we have some more questions. You spoke to this a little bit, but do you have to at some point say, then I'm 85% sure and hit the post? As far
Oh,
as
no, we have to be first, best, and right. There's a question here about the balancing the publish first mentality with fact checking. We want to be first and we want to be best, but being right is the prerequisite for all of that. We can't post something that we hope is true or we think is true. It has to be true.
But there's a caveat to that. So you're in a debate about abortion in the state house, and there's real diametrically opposed views. And so you will somebody says something is great and somebody else says it's bad. The idea is to put those two views in there, and here they are. Here are the ideas out there, and the reader can read into that what they want and kind of make their own decision. These are the public statements. And I'll tell you what, Sam Brownback was running for re-election against Paul Davis. And I chafed when back in the old days, when politicians called another politician a liar. Because a lie means that you are intentionally deceptive. It's not a mistake, or I misread the stats, or I just have the wrong conclusion. He called Paul Davis a liar, saying that the Kansas didn't have a budget problem. Well, I would just cut that from quotes. I just left that sentence out of my stories because I just couldn't. Brownback wasn't proving that Paul Davis was a liar. So I didn't write that. Kind of in hindsight, because a week after the Brownback won re-election, they announced that Kansas had a hundreds and hundreds of $1 million budget problem. So Brownback had kind of concealed the fact that Kansas had issues, and him calling Paul Davis a liar was an actual lie. And so I regretted not having that word lie in my previous election stories about Brownback. So sometimes I've then thus concluded that I need to include things in stories that I may not believe to be absolutely true, but here's a quote from the lieutenant governor or the Senate president or the Democrat minority leader in the House who says X. We've got other people in our story saying Y, Z, A, B, and C. And so somewhere in there, we'll divine the truth. But sometimes you put things in stories that you're skeptical about, but it's attributed to that person, and you're not saying yourself that you believe this to be 100% true.
Covering the legislature, we run into this constantly where you kind of have to fact check in real time what they're saying and whether it's, true or just oftentimes raging bullshit. And, we have people who describe things in a certain way, like they'll describe this plan to funnel a whole bunch of money to private school kids who are already in private schools as a school choice bill. And so you kind of have to say, actually, this isn't a choice bill. This is what they're really doing, and that gets us into conflict sometimes with legislative leaders. But I think about there's how Margaret Sullivan put it. She was a critic, in-house critic for the New York Times and Washington Post, who kind of rose to prominence over the past 5 or 6 years. And she had a book out last year where she said, if somebody says it's raining outside and somebody else says it's sunny outside, the reporter's job is to go outside and look, right? Not just to say that there are two people saying two different
Yeah, here's
things.
another example. The House and Senate debate this week about the flat tax and the other elements of the tax reform. Uh, the Republicans who are pushing it said, hey, everybody gets a tax break. That's true. There's probably everybody in the state in some measure will benefit from that legislation if it became law. But it's responsibility of the reporter to put the additional information in there. Yes, but in this part of the tax plan, the wealthy benefit far more than the middle class. In this part, where you eliminate the remainder of the state sales tax on food, everybody benefits the same depending on what food you buy. And so you just have to layer the story with more information that'll provide context for people to understand more about what the politicians are saying. Because politicians are all about rhetoric, they want that bumper sticker thing that says everybody wins. And you have to realize that there's winners and losers. Like in this flat tax, given my salary, I think my benefit is about $1 a year. But if I had a salary twice as high, I'd benefit to the tune of hundreds of dollars a year. So but I'm getting a tax break, right? So you just have to explain things a little bit.
I do want to address this point about the influence of our donors, just to make it clear that our donors don't have any influence over what we write. Um, you know, there's a question here that says we're perhaps funded largely by wealthy donors. That may be true. I don't know what money is coming from which donor exactly. I know that locally we get $5 donations all the time. So they come in all sorts of sizes, but nobody gets to say what we write or how we write it or what we don't write.
I've had conversations with some Kansas donors who would call me up and say, how do I send a check? But they don't say, I'll send this check if in the next 3 weeks you write X, Y, and Z stories. So, and in terms of our parent nonprofit in North Carolina, they've edited a few of my stories, but I've had zero conversations with editors there about the content and the stories that I choose to write about. It is absolutely true that journalists have biases and subjective histories about themselves that guide primarily the stories they decide to write. Like I might be drawn, I have an ag background. I might be drawn to write a story about fertilizers or federal funding of agriculture programs or something like that. But Sherman, who doesn't have that history maybe of living on a farm, might be drawn to another issue about cybersecurity and technology. So we do have these biases in our own personal being that might, of the 25 stories I could do on any given day in the State House, the 3 or 4 that we focus on that day, that depends kind of on the people too. And we get to decide. We are deciding what we write about, and we're also responsible for the stories we pick. And other reporters in the State House might tomorrow pick a different story than we do.
Do journalists have a code of ethics? And if no, do you think one is necessary and why?
Yeah, we do have an ethics policy on our website, and you know, I do think it's necessary. I think it's an important guide for us to have. I think ours is generally modeled on the Society of Professional Journalists. They're kind of the gold standard for these.
I remember talking to people who used to cover the Chiefs in the 60s, and at the end of the season, they'd have this raffle thing, and they gave sports writers who covered the Chiefs like TVs and stuff. And I don't take any of that. When
Yeah.
I go cover something and people want to sit down and talk, I said, I'll drink your cup of coffee. Okay. Sherman gave me a cup of coffee this morning, and I'll buy somebody else a cup of coffee because that's being polite. But I don't buy meals for people, sources. I don't pay for stories. People don't pay me to do anything. I would never take it. I would never take it.
Yeah, I've angered people before by refusing to take one of their homemade cookies from a booth that they set up at the State House.
And that becomes an issue if you're in somebody's home, and I guess that there's an
Yeah.
exception to my coffee rule. If somebody asks me 3 times, please sit down with us and have a hamburger. I mean, I just can't be rude. I mean, it's like your mother-in-law or
Yeah.
something telling you 3 times to have a sandwich, and you just kind of give up, like, okay.
Yeah.
But in terms of lobbyists and stuff like that, I mean, people don't even offer, us those kind of incentives.
Uh, Do writers use artificial intelligence or chat GPT?
First of all, I am the least IT skilled reporter, I think, in the state of Kansas. I wouldn't know where to begin with that, but if you read that copy, it's lousy. And
Yeah.
it's like it is a robot, and it's not necessarily accurate. The wording is halting, it's ridiculous. And I mean, the technology that will really write a comprehensive breaking news story, I think, is years away. And so I don't know. There's a lot of anxiety about IT, in terms of journalism today, there's nobody in Kansas that I think relies on IT stuff. I mean, they're writing their own stories.
So the first time somebody asked me this, I dismissed it out of hand. Like, of course we don't use artificial intelligence. But then I thought a little bit more about some of the technology we use. We use a platform called Otter.ai to transcribe audio into notes for us. That is a form of AI that we rely on to quickly get to the part of the interview where we needed to pull a quote from. We can play it back and grab that quote. Um, so I think there's ways that we can use these tools to help us. Um,
I
I,
didn't know that was AI, but on my phone here, I can record this conversation, and in real time, I can hit a button and it'll do a transcript here, and I can follow along, which would allow me to timestamp my written notes to say at 2 minutes and 45 seconds into this conversation, there was a poignant remark by somebody. But the audio is there and the transcript is not precise. So if I chose to use that quote from 2 minutes and 45 seconds in, I would go back and listen to it because
Mhm.
sometimes the transcript doesn't pick up the words the and a, or they might just a proper noun might be garbled or something. So you have to listen to the real audio to get the quotes right. And this kind of technology, I mean, I used to carry around tape recorders that were bigger than 2 bricks, to record things, and to have it on your phone and to have an archive here of interviews on your phone has been a fabulous, fabulous thing. I didn't really
Mhm.
realize this was considered AI.
So there's I think a number of examples like that. When we have a photo in Photoshop and we're trying to correct the color or the lighting, that's, you could consider all of that to be artificial intelligence that Photoshop is using on the back end.
Hmm.
There was a time, so my wife's an accountant. So I asked her one time, how do I do this in Excel and over a text? And she was like, why are you bothering me? Just ask ChatGPT. It'll tell you how to use Excel. And I thought, oh yeah, I guess I could do that.
But in terms of writing stories,
Right.
that's not done. I don't know
Well,
who's doing that. It's people that aren't serious about journalism, I guarantee you.
the parent company of our former employer, Gannett, has done some AI reporting in
Hmm.
places. They got some attention for some sports stories out of Tennessee, I think it was, and they were so awkward and just kind of laughable. It got some attention, and it is the one time we've received a directive from State's newsroom. They just put out a note that said, "Our expectation is that humans write all of our stories."
And Gannett, the largest newspaper chain in America, when I say not serious about journalism, that's exactly what I mean. You putting out a story written by AI is a joke.
Yeah.
Covering the state capitol, how receptive are our elected officials to journalists?
Well, depends
So
on the official.
yeah, like and it varies between Republicans and Democrats like us. Republicans and Democrats don't like us. But basically, the people that might get in our face and tell us that we're screwing up would be people that they're not really interested in fair and balanced reporting. They're interested in reporting that reflects well on themselves. And and so they don't want us to include they want us to take the Republicans' comment or the Democrats' comment and not put the rival perspective in stories. And so lots of times when you're right on the money and you get all sides of an equation there's people that just don't like that because they don't appreciate people saying that their own views are dead wrong. So there's people that try to push back. And in the last 20 years, politicians have taken the tactic of using social media themselves to go around reporters. So they try to reach directly out through emails, texts, and what have you, directly out to voters. So there's been an attempt by politicians to go around news media, and that's certainly I think that's useful to voters, but it's a little bit of an echo chamber there that you're going to have.
I get concerned that it seems like few legislators actually consume news on a regular basis. And it's the ones who never read news stories who seem to be the most vocal critics of journalism.
What changes would you like to see at the Capitol to increase transparency in journalism and reporting?
Okay, there's a lot of different things, but in COVID, the legislators they were separated by distance, and some of them sat up in the galleries even. But during COVID, they pulled all the reporters off the House and Senate floors. There's dedicated bench seating down there for reporters. The House has allowed reporters to return to the House chamber floor, where you can be more accessible to legislators, and and you can see the expression on legislators' faces as they make a comment. If you were But the Senate has not allowed reporters back because they want to crack jokes down there on the Senate floor and say things under their breath they don't want reporters hearing. An advent of COVID that was really tremendous and a huge breakthrough in terms of transparency, and gets at something I've always been irritated about is that all House and Senate committees, all House and Senate sessions are on YouTube, are streamed and archived. So the farmer out in Garden City who wants to keep track of the House and Senate Ag committees can, once a month, can get on there and spend an hour and a half and watch the Ag House and Senate committees on video. And it's high quality, and you can go to the committees that were meeting in themselves and read written testimony that's posted online. So in terms of people from afar being able to find out what their elected representatives are doing under the dome has been greatly expanded by COVID, and that is a huge change that's occurred. There's issues that Sherman may have others, but there's this thing where bills are introduced in committee without a name attached. You don't know who introduced the bill. And it used to be, if you go back 75 years, almost all bills had a name attached to them. Even if I was Representative Tim Carpenter and I was introducing a bill in committee on tax, might say I'm introducing this on behalf of the Jefferson County group for tax fairness. So there's a lot less transparency when it comes to that.
Yeah, sometimes you have to go back and actually look at who is standing at the mic introducing the bill, because when it appears online, it just says that it was sponsored by the committee. And so you don't know who is the individual, the lobbyist or, lawmaker, individual representative. Anybody could go up and introduce a bill, but you don't know who it is by looking at the bill page. And so that's a problem. I get concerned about, last minute changes in the calendar, so-called informational hearings, where they say it's not a bill hearing, so we don't have to give both sides. We're just going to invite two people who are, highly biased on this topic. Sometimes they're going to give an hour presentation that is totally misinformation or disinformation. And then suddenly a bill materializes the next morning that we can go ahead and vote on because we heard the informational thing yesterday.
What Sherman talking about is normally you would have a committee hearing and you can just sign up. You or any person can go testify on most bills, and you would just sign up in advance, submit your written testimony, go up there and make your remarks and sit down. But sometimes that's a regular committee meeting, and the legislators will ask you questions as you're testifying, and they get all comers, all kinds of like lobbyists get up there and organizational people and just regular citizens will get up there and say their 2 cents worth and sit down. But you have informational hearings which are biased and leaning in one direction and not intended to reveal the broad scope of a public policy issue.
Other times where they'll announce on an afternoon or an evening, you've got to have your testimony in within hours if you want to participate in this hearing that we just now decided we're going to have. But when you show up to the hearing, it's very clear that one side of the bill had days or weeks to prepare their testimony, has had it in days in advance, but they didn't announce it until the last second for the other side.
Here's another problem. On the House and Senate floors, if you're debating a bill, some member brings an amendment to the bill, and there's a rule that allows that we'll say the bill is about health care and somebody wants to put Medicaid expansion into that health bill. It clearly is the same subject, right? But you can have a germaneness challenge to that, and there's actually a little committee of House and Senate members that decide whether it's germane to the bill. And those decisions are very frequently made on a partisan basis that have nothing to do with the rules of germaneness. And I think that's a problem area where the party in power that has a majority on that rules committee can decide germaneness based on partisan issues. And there needs to be a better system of that.
Typically, you would debate a bill on the floor and decide whether or not to move forward, and then you would come back a full day later and have the actual vote on the bill. What we see regularly now, especially on the Senate, almost every time they're in session, they'll suspend the rules. They'll declare an emergency, suspend the rules, so that they can just immediately fast track this bill and not have to worry about getting public
And
feedback.
the legislature in other states are probably like this. There's a bajillion rules of procedure. But if you have the majority votes, and you can take a vote on whether to just like sideline the rule. So if you have the votes, no rule matters. You can do practically anything you want if you have the votes, which makes the rules kind of preposterous.
The final thing I would say is virtually all the legislation that ends up getting passed is passed in the final 72 hours. They get bundled into these giant, pieces of legislation. In one case, it was, I think, 29 different tax bills, including some that had not had a hearing, some that had not passed either house. These things just get shoved together at the last second. They're debating.
Legislators don't even know what they're voting on. Bundle bills are terrible. Here's another thing that's wrong. There's a rule that sometimes applied. You're not supposed to start debate on a bill after midnight. And they get these legislators are all whipped and tired at 3 o'clock in the morning to try to get them to vote on a bill just to get out. And I've left the Capitol at dawn before, up all night as they debated things, and walked out with a legislator who was 70 something years old and asked him, a senator from Manhattan, are you going to be okay on the drive home? He goes, yep, it's 57 minutes to my driveway. I've got this. And I remember leaving very early in the morning one time, and a bunch of legislators were tired. And I don't know the cause of the wreck out there on I-70, but a highly regarded state house member died on the highway when he drove off the road with the cruise control on and died. And I don't know if he had a heart attack and died, fell asleep and died, but whatever. This is outrageous that they're forcing people to debate things in the middle of the night, and it's a huge disservice to the public who should be able to see this stuff in the bright light of day.
We have a couple other questions here. Recently, I read that Medicaid expansion is not the only reason small hospitals are closing. It's stated that Medicare Advantage has become a problem by reducing reimbursement. Do you know if that is impacting Kansas hospitals?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why rural hospitals are struggling, and compensation for services is absolutely one of them. And I've heard complaints about Medicaid Advantage in terms of if you're running a medical facility. But make no mistake, Medicaid expansion would bring hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in medical care funding into the state. And first of all, some 100,000 plus people would have a preventive and emergency health care. But also these people are going to be going to medical facilities, and you would have those resources would be funneled through that. It's not going to necessarily save a hospital that's administratively run badly, not necessarily, but it's certainly going to change the dynamic and make Kansas on par with the 4 states around it. Because you go down in southeast Kansas, and the hospital administrators will tell you Missouri and Oklahoma have Medicaid expansion, and they're poaching our nurses. The nurses can just drive another 15 miles and go work in Joplin, Missouri, and we're having trouble hiring nurses. So there's an equity thing just in the surrounding states, not to mention the health benefits that would be derived by people that are basically the working poor.
Yeah, Rachel wrote this story out of Pittsburgh where she talked to the sheriff, and he told her about how there are times where they have people who need attention, need care, and their choice is they can throw them in jail for a night and then turn them loose, and who knows what's going to happen to them. Um, Not because they did something wrong, just because they need medical attention. And so, in at least one case, he just instructed his deputy to drive them across the border into Missouri and leave her there because there they actually have medical care.
Yeah, the hospitals are struggling in part because uncompensated care. When you go, hospitals cannot turn sick people away. So you go to KU Medical Center with a gunshot wound and you have no health insurance, they're going to throw you into the ER and do surgery, and it's going to cost thousands of dollars, and they may not get that money ever from that individual. So uncompensated care in hospitals across the state is an issue. You have in some rural communities really smaller hospitals that have really dramatically aging populations, and so that client base of actually people with insurance who are healthy that don't that are good for the providers, you have a less of that. So you have the population density and their degree of illness is a factor too. So there's a lot of different things here, but there's only 10 states that have an expanded Medicaid under this federal program, and that's the South, Kansas, and a couple others. And these southern states are tipping. They're gonna, in the end, Kansas could be among 2 or 3 states. And why would 40 states do something and 10 not? I think it has to do with ideology and not about healthcare.
Here's one. There's lots of media saying the Biden-Harris administration is getting nothing done. I talked to a farm friend in Missouri, and they're finally getting broadband. Is there a plan to look into ordinary Kansans who are benefiting from current policies? I would like to read this. Also about infrastructure benefits here in Kansas.
Yeah, I know that it's frustrating for people in Democrats in the political arena that they're not getting enough credit for the kind of real everyday work that the infrastructure plan is accomplishing. We've written about some of the infrastructure broadband investments that are happening in Kansas. I know that it is making a difference. Other infrastructure projects where there have been big like news conferences and the politicians all show up to tout, ribbon cutting or whatever. And I have tried to make a point of saying, like, yeah, actually, the senator who is standing here championing this voted against the bill that's funding it, as just to make that point. But
COVID and these other federal programs have dumped tens of millions of dollars into broadband expansion in Kansas, and the other states are the same. So the deficit in rural areas was enormous. And it's because these telephone companies and service providers just see profit in being in Johnson County or in Leavenworth, but not necessarily 15 miles outside of Leavenworth. There's just not that profit. And in my parents' farm is near Lee Summit, Missouri, and they ran fiber optic on the other side of the street, which has regular houses on it. And the farm and the farmhouse, there's a whole like quarter mile where there's no houses on this side of the street. Cox would not run the wire up to my parents' house, but the people across the street have it. It was, to me, outrageous. But government has tried to come in and throw money at these service providers to get them to expand the next network. And it is, to me, I think, we all deserve 911 to call, the police to come and the fire, and we all deserve, fire hydrants out there to put out fires. I think eventually broadband will become one of those infrastructure pieces that government and society will recognize is essential for everybody, for education, jobs, the farmer who needs it desperately to have a good linkage. There's state senators that can't make a phone call from their house.
I think what the Biden administration is doing with broadband is reminiscent of what the Roosevelt administration did with electricity in the early 30s, of saying, we've got to get this out to people, even if it's not profitable for a company.
And if Biden is not getting the credit he thinks he deserves, he needs to step up his PR game. I mean, that's part of the campaign, is to say it was better under Donald Trump, or it's better, it's good. There are good things here that President Biden has and Congress have done. That's all about messaging, and they need to get off their rear end and talk about it if they want people to recognize what they've done well and or what they've done poorly.
Some of our Kansas newspapers appear to be owned and published by people who have some pretty biased views. What suggestions do you have for communities or citizens served by those papers?
Well, first of all, I've worked at papers that had, well, the Lawrence Journal World, they had a publisher, Dolph Simons, who was very conservative, big R. The Capital Journal, in all those years, I think, had some pretty conservative editorials, but maybe more centrist. So these smaller newspapers, it's harder because you have a publisher and editor, they own it, and they have 6 employees. And so the infiltration of the publisher's views on the news coverage is probably more intense than you would have at a larger paper, which has a publisher, an editorial writer, and owners who created a firewall between themselves and the reporters. And the reporters should go about their business. I've written tons of stories over those 30 years that I worked at newspapers that probably made the publisher take his fingernails and run them down the chalkboard. But that's tough luck. That's the way it should be. I should go out there and cover the stuff, write the best news story I had. He can sit back in his office and write an editorial and tell him I'm full of baloney. So there needs to be a firewall, but that's tougher at smaller properties.
I would say that we have the same situation at the Kansas Reflector, where, Clay may be writing something with a obvious liberal bias or point of view, which, we put opinion in a big header across what he's saying. And Tim and I may not even agree with what he's saying on a given
Right.
day. But it doesn't matter for what we're reporting. I mean, I don't tell Clay what his opinion can be. He doesn't tell me what to report.
Right. And so I read these editorials that Clay writes just at the same timeline as anybody else. I look online and read what he writes, and some of them I would be cheer on, and some of them I think are just totally off base. So that's just the normal thing you would see in any kind of newspaper. But the firewall is important.
Yeah.
We only have a few more minutes left. So do you have any wrap-up comments, or do you want to take another question or two?
I think I would take another question or
Sure.
two if we got them.
Yeah.
Here's one. Has the newspaper debacle in Marion haunted the Reflector or other papers?
I don't think it's haunted so much as it empowered the media in the state to know that we're all going to fight back against this. And it got such extraordinary attention that I think it really sent a message to authorities who might try to pick on journalists.
It also made it clear that we were maybe negligent in my thinking that this couldn't happen. I thought this couldn't happen, that no law enforcement official would be dumb enough to walk into a newsroom and start seizing computers because they didn't like the news coverage. Because the alleged crime is baloney, is not going to hold up. And the police chief was just irritated about investigations that paper was doing. And they came in and they've been shown that they overstepped and they shouldn't have behaved that way. And eventually they'll pay the piper for it. But I think it's just made very clear that we need to be aware of this and be prepared for that notion. And I know that I'm on this kind of communications committee on the Kansas Bar Association, and they've had posters printed up that they're going to distribute to newspapers that actually, because of Marion, are going to say in black and white that if the cops come in to your newspaper office, here's what you ought to do. And so it's just a warning. It's a warning sign that things could go sideways out there. And obviously, the people that perpetrated that raid had no idea of the consequences of what they were doing. Least of all, the fact that one of the co-owners of the paper would die a day after the raid.
I think it was really concerning, as we learned later. I think I published this in November, that the local police chief had his motivations, but he didn't act alone. He did this with support from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, from uh, Kansas Department of Revenue, State Fire Marshal's Office, the county sheriff, the DA, a magistrate judge, and nobody anywhere stopped to say, like, what are we doing? Maybe this is a bad idea. Hopefully that, this shows that the next time somebody locally wants to go rogue, everybody doesn't just pile on and support them.
It doesn't seem like the newspapers focus on where funding is coming from to get people like Tide Masterson elected. There is a ton of dark money outside of the reporting process. Why is that? What about legislators that have huge conflicts of interest but still legislate things like budget line items that go to their special interest?
There's two parts of that. I think we could do more reporting about campaign finance, but there is a lot of dark money that we're never going to figure out where it came from. That's the definition of dark money. And the people in leadership receive most of those dollars. I'm not sure the answer to that other than a congressional action to change transparency laws about campaign finance and make dark money go away.
Citizens United is a hurdle to even making those kind of changes in law. I think we could do a better job of pointing out, you know, maybe not process probably isn't the right word, but all this money is being funneled into leadership, into their personal PACs, so that they can then dictate who they're going to support for reelection. And if somebody in the rank and file is stepping out of line, they can use that money in their war chest to go find a primary challenger and drive them out. That's one of the big issues. I do want to say we had an article you can find over the summer by a political scientist at Washburn University. It was an opinion article. Amber Dickinson is her name, but she did look at the dark money here. And off the top of my head, it was something like 99% of Ty Masterson's money is coming from dark money sources.
And he's allied with the Coke industries down there. The second part of your question was about the legislature and people having built-in conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that by design, the Kansas legislature is a citizen legislature. It's a part-time job. They want people to have real lives out of the building. And so you'll have farmers, lawyers, plumbers, truck drivers, teachers, whatever. And you're supposed to bring those real-world experiences with you as you come to the Capitol. And so it does create conflicts of interest, but the way you get around that, there's multiple avenues. One, you can just stand up in a committee meeting or on the House floor and walk away. You don't have to vote. Another is to stand up in those forums and declare your conflict. Hello, I'm Bob, and I am a hog farmer, and we're going to vote on a corporate hog farming bill in the next 30 minutes. And I'll tell you what, I know more about hog farming than half of you here, and I'm going to stay here and be part of this debate and vote on the bill. And so you can kind of declare your conflict, and that makes it transparent to everyone that you have this experience, you have this knowledge, and that you're going to stay in it. Now, somebody can come down there and counter that and say, how dare you bring your conflict of interest into the building like this? So it's a citizen legislature. The alternative is a full-time legislator where we pay these people, they are getting big raises coming up, but because their salaries were terrible, but we could pay them all $100,000 a year and they'd be full-time legislators, and we could have a professional class of politician. And I don't think a lot of people are very interested in that.
And one last question, what can we do to help media in Kansas be beneficial?
I think the most important thing is that you're reading news stories, not just us, but a variety of them, talking to others about the importance of this. I was reading through results of a American Press Institute poll that they did recently before this, and only about a quarter of people say that they regularly seek out news stories. Most of the people who read news just happen to stumble upon it on social media or somebody sends it to them. We need a society that wants to be informed and is seeking this stuff out.
I think Sherman's absolutely right. Read us. For decades, I've tried to read widely in terms of news coverage of whatever I could get my hands on, because somewhere in my mind, the answer's in the middle somewhere. But I would also say subscribe to your local paper, and if you feel like you can't afford that subscription yourself, maybe two of your neighbors you can all get it together. Somebody will get the paper thrown on their driveway, read it, and walk it across the street. But I think it's important to support local newspapers and journalists. And it's sort of like a chicken and egg. They can't go cover the school board meeting that you want covered because they don't have the people. But if they picked up an extra, 200 subscribers, maybe they could hire that part-time person to go cover school board. The Marion County paper, the number of online subscriptions to that went up by hundreds, I think.
Even in print, so I think he's now like the fourth or fifth, something like that, biggest subscription newspaper in
Right.
Kansas.
So people threw their money at them to say, hey, stay in business, keep fighting this. But I think supporting local newspapers is a great idea. But just read.
Thank
Well,
you so much.
unfortunately our time is up, but gosh, Sherman, Tim, thank you so much for educating us today, sharing your profession, answering all our questions, being patient with us. We really appreciate it. And to everybody who came on, thanks for coming today. Stay warm and save the date. February 17th is our next meeting. And again, thank you guys very much.
Thank you so much for having us.
How many is in there?